Rome, before it was an empire, before it was even a city, it was an idea, born not in the certainty of history, but in the fog of myth. The story begins with a whisper. Twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, sons of a god, abandoned to the river, destined to die. But legend tells us they were saved, nurtured by a she-wolf, a powerful, symbolic birth for a power that would one day consume the known world. But what if this is more than just a foundational myth? What if it's a carefully crafted code, a message left behind to obscure a more complex, perhaps more clandestine, truth? Historians like Professor Andrea Carandini have spent their lives excavating the Palatine Hill, searching for physical proof of what the ancients called Roma Quadrata, the sacred first settlement. He argues that the myth hides the truth of a violent, ritualistic founding. Was Romulus's fabled murder of his brother Remus simply a family quarrel? Or was it the first in a long line of secret power plays, the bloody inauguration of a legacy built on secrets as much as on stone?
Welcome to Secrets of the Ancients, where ancient mysteries awaken.
Let's return now, back through the veil of time. Before the legions, before the marble, before the name of Rome echoed in every corner of the known world. Let's go back to its infancy, to a time of mist and whispers, a period shrouded in what the Romans themselves called the inopia literarum, a poverty of letters. This is the era of the Seven Kings, an age so distant that history and myth bleed into one another, leaving behind only ghostly traces and profound, unsettling questions. Our story, or rather our investigation, begins on the Palatine Hill. Feel the gentle slope of the land beneath your feet. This is not just any hill. To the Romans, this was the sacred heart of their origin. It was here that the she-wolf's cave supposedly lay. It was here that Romulus, after the fateful quarrel with his twin, is said to have carved the primordial boundary of his city, the Palmyrium, with a bronze plow, a sacred furrow in the earth, separating the world of men, herbs, from the world of raw nature, Ager. But the first act of this new city was not one of construction, but of bloodshed, fratricide, the murder of a brother. What does it tell us about the deep, psychic DNA of a civilization when its founding act is the ultimate betrayal? Philosophically, it suggests that from its very inception, Rome understood a brutal truth. For the city to live, for the collective to thrive, the individual, even a brother, a twin, a mirror image, could be sacrificed. The state, the grand idea of Rome, was paramount. This was not a flaw in the design, it was the design itself, a chilling principle that would echo for 1,000 years. Romulus, the warrior king, forged his city from this principle. The official histories, written centuries later by men like Livy, tell us he was a brilliant pragmatist. He needed people, so he declared his fledgling settlement an asylum, a sanctuary for outlaws, exiles, and refugees, a city of desperate men hungry for a second chance. But this created a new crisis, a profound demographic imbalance. A city of men cannot endure. And so we come to one of Rome's most infamous and telling episodes, the rape of the Sabine women. The term rape here comes from the Latin raptio, meaning abduction, a seizing. But the brutality is not lost in translation. Romulus invited the neighboring Sabine tribe to a festival, and at his signal, the Roman men seized the unmarried daughters as their brides. It's a story of shocking violence, but to dismiss it as mere barbarism is to miss the point. This was cold, calculated statecraft. It was a violent, forced integration, a way to secure the future by stealing it. It established another core Roman tenet: what we cannot create, we will take. What we cannot persuade, we will conquer and absorb. Rome would not just grow, it would consume. After a life of war and conquest, Romulus himself is said to have vanished mysteriously in a storm. Was he taken up to the heavens to become the god Quirinus, as the patricians claimed? Or, as some whispered, was he torn apart by those same senators, tired of his autocratic rule? The first king's reign ends, fittingly, not with a clear answer, but with a dark question mark. And then a strange and sudden peace descends. The pendulum swings from the violent warrior to the pious priest. Numa Pompilius, a Sabine, interestingly enough, chosen to rule the city that had abducted his people's daughters. He is a ghostly figure, almost too perfect to be real. While Romulus gave Rome its body and its laws of men, Numa is said to have given it its soul and its laws of the gods. He established the great priestly colleges, including the Vestal Virgins, and he created the office of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, a title that would, astonishingly, survive the fall of the empire and be adopted by the popes of a new faith. Numa's most potent symbol was the temple of Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings and endings. Its great bronze doors were to be closed only in times of total peace. During Numa's entire 43-year reign, they were never opened. Think about that. 43 years of absolute peace, immediately following a period of brutal, foundational violence. Is this history, or is it a carefully constructed political narrative? Perhaps Numa was a later invention, a fabrication designed to give Rome a peaceful, pious heritage it desperately needed to legitimize its future conquests. He represents the ideal of the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. If the rituals were correct, if the gods were appeased, then Rome would be protected. It was a sacred contract. A contract that would be used to justify centuries of warfare, all waged in the name of maintaining that divine peace. The peace, of course, did not last. The pendulum swings back to war with the third king, Tullus Hostilius. His reign is defined by a single brutal conflict with Rome's mother city, Alba Longa. But even here, the story takes a turn into the mythic, avoiding the grim reality of total war. The fate of both cities was decided by a single combat between two sets of triplets, the Horatii for Rome and the Curiatii for Alba Longa. It's a heroic tale of sacrifice and duty, but it's a narrative mask. The historical reality is that Rome utterly destroyed its parent, razing the city and forcibly relocating its entire population to Rome itself. The pattern of consumption continues. Alba Longa was not just defeated, it was erased from the map, and its identity was absorbed into the growing Roman state. After Tullus comes Ancus Marcius, Numa's grandson, a king who balanced both war and peace. Geographically, he made one of the most critical moves in early Roman history. He pushed Roman territory west, down the Tiber River to the sea. There, at the river's mouth, he founded the port city of Ostia. Imagine the shift in perspective this created. For the first time, Rome was no longer just a local, land-based power. It was looking outward to the horizon. Ostia was Rome's first gateway to the wider Mediterranean world, a world of Greek colonies, Phoenician traders, and the great, enigmatic Etruscan civilization to the north. Ostia was a declaration of intent. And it was this new, outward-looking Rome that would attract a new kind of influence, one that would change the city forever. And here the mystery deepens profoundly. With the fifth king, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the bloodline and culture of Rome's leadership changes. Priscus was an Etruscan. He came from the city of Tarquinia, part of the advanced, wealthy, and culturally dominant Etruscan League. The Etruscans were a people whose language we still cannot fully decipher, whose origins are still debated by scholars. They were masters of metallurgy, divination, and hydraulic engineering, and suddenly one of them is the king of Rome. The official story is that he moved to Rome seeking opportunity and won over the people and the previous king with his charisma and wealth. But this seems too simple. Could his rise have been a form of soft coup, a takeover orchestrated not by armies but by money, influence, and technological superiority? Under Tarquin, Rome began to look less like a Latin town and more like a great Etruscan city. He is credited with initiating the construction of the Circus Maximus for chariot races, and the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. Most significantly, he began the Cloaca Maxima. The Cloaca Maxima, we translate it as the Great Sewer, but that fails to capture the sheer scale of the achievement. This was a monumental drainage project that transformed the marshy, swampy valley between the hills, an uninhabitable floodplain, into the dry, usable land that would become the very center of Roman life, the Roman Forum. This required a level of engineering knowledge, of organized labor, of long-term planning, that seems a quantum leap beyond what Rome had previously demonstrated. Was this Roman ingenuity, or was it an imported technology, a gift, or a tool from the more advanced Etruscans, a project designed to embed their influence into the very bedrock of the city? The Etruscan influence continued with the sixth king, Servius Tullius. His own origins are shrouded in mystery. One story claims he was born a slave whose head miraculously burst into flames without harming him, a clear sign of divine favor. Under his rule, Rome's first constitution and its first census were implemented. On the surface, these are administrative reforms, but look deeper. The census divided citizens into classes based on wealth, determining their military duty and their voting power. This is a highly sophisticated system of social and military organization. It is a tool for control, for taxation, for raising massive armies with ruthless efficiency. It feels less like an organic Latin development and more like the imposition of a highly structured foreign model of governance. The Etruscan grip on Rome seemed absolute, and perhaps that is why it had to be broken. The final king, the seventh, was Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He was the son of Priscus, and he ruled as an absolute tyrant. He built great things, finishing the temple his father started, but he did so through terror and oppression, alienating the Roman nobility. The breaking point, the spark that ignited the revolution, was a deeply personal and horrific crime, the rape of the virtuous noblewoman Lucretia by the king's son. Lucretia's subsequent suicide after making her husband and father swear an oath of vengeance was the catalyst. A rebellion led by the nobleman Lucius Junius Brutus erupted. The monarchy was overthrown and the Tarquins were exiled forever. In 509 B.C., the Roman Republic was born. But again, we must ask the question, was it truly a spontaneous uprising born of righteous fury over a single terrible crime? Or was Lucretia's tragedy simply the perfect pretext, the public justification for a coup that the Latin aristocracy had been planning for years? a way to reclaim their city from the powerful, overbearing influence of the Etruscans. They didn't just exile a king, they exiled a culture, a dynasty. They cast off their old masters. The age of kings ends. It leaves us with a narrative full of ghosts, of shadowy figures, of unanswered questions. It is a foundation built on a paradox, a deep-seated piety mixed with brutal pragmatism, a fierce independence forged by absorbing and then rejecting foreign influence, and a story of civic virtue that begins with the murder of a brother. This is the soil from which the Republic and later the Empire would grow, and all of its future triumphs and tragedies are rooted here, in the enigmatic darkness of its own beginning. And so the last Etruscan king flees into the night, and a new idea, a dangerous and exhilarating experiment, takes root in the 7 hills of Rome. They called it res publica, the public thing, the property of the people, the republic. It was a defiant rejection of the absolute power of a single man. In his place, they created a system of elegant complexity, 2 consuls elected annually, each with the power to veto the other. A senate filled with the heads of the great patrician families, whose auctoritas, their unspoken, almost spiritual authority, guided the state, and the assemblies where the citizens of Rome, the populus Romanus, could cast their votes. On the surface, it was a masterpiece of checks and balances, a government designed for a small, agrarian city-state, founded on the principle of shared power and civic duty. But we must look deeper, beneath the polished surface of this new political machine. The early republic was not a harmonious partnership. It was a cauldron of social tension, a quiet, simmering class war between 2 Romes. There were the patricians, the elite families who traced their lineage back to the first senators appointed by Romulus himself. They were the keepers of the sacred rites, the interpreters of law, the commanders of armies. They held the keys to the kingdom, both spiritual and temporal. And then there was everyone else, the plebeians, the farmers, the artisans, the merchants, the common soldiers. They were the backbone of Rome, the men who bled for it in its endless wars, yet they were almost powerless. In the early republic, they could not hold high office, they could not marry into patrician families, and most critically, they were subject to laws they had no hand in writing, unwritten laws held secretly in the minds of patrician priests. And they were perpetually trapped in a cycle of debt, a system known as nexum, which could lead to indentured servitude, a kind of temporary slavery, to the very aristocrats whose lands they defended. This imbalance was unsustainable. The patricians needed the plebeians to fight their wars, and in that need the plebeians found their voice and their ultimate weapon. It was called the secessio plebis, the secession of the plebs. It was, in effect, the world's first recorded general strike. On several occasions, the entire plebeian population abandoned Rome, marched out of the city to a nearby hill, and simply refused to participate. They refused to work, refused to serve in the army, refused to be governed. They brought the state to a total standstill. Imagine the chilling silence in the Roman Forum, the empty marketplaces, the defenseless city walls. The patricians were forced to negotiate, and out of this tension the republic was truly forged. The plebeians won the right to elect their own officials, the tribunes of the plebs. These were extraordinary figures, whose bodies were declared sacrosanct. It was a capital and religious crime to harm them. They were given the power of the veto, the ability to block any act of a magistrate or the Senate that they deemed harmful to the common people. And they demanded that the law be written down. They were tired of the secret knowledge of the patricians. The result was the 12 tables, bronze tablets erected in the forum for all to see. They were harsh, they were patriarchal, but they were public. For the first time, the law was a known quantity, not a private weapon. These victories were monumental, but we must ask, did the patrician class ever truly surrender power, or did they just become more adept at managing the illusion of it? They controlled the levers of religion, declaring certain days unfit for assemblies, thereby postponing inconvenient votes. They dominated the Senate, the true center of enduring power. They mastered the art of political theater. The struggle of the orders wasn't a revolution that overthrew an elite. It was a long, slow, grudging negotiation that allowed the elite to maintain control by making just enough concessions to prevent the entire system from tearing itself apart. It was a web of power, constantly being respun to accommodate new pressures. While this internal drama unfolded, Rome was engaged in an almost constant state of external warfare. For 200 years, it fought brutal campaigns against its Italian neighbors, the Equi, the Volsci, the Samnites. This wasn't just conquest, it was a laboratory. In unifying the Italian peninsula, Rome perfected its unique form of statecraft. It didn't treat every conquered people the same. Some were granted full Roman citizenship. Others received partial rights. Most became allies, retaining local autonomy but required to provide soldiers for the Roman legions. This was genius. It wasn't just a system of control. It was a system of incentives. It created a vast reservoir of manpower that no other state in the Mediterranean could match. And this reservoir would be tested to its absolute limit, because as Rome looked south, across the sea to the island of Sicily, its gaze fell upon the other great power of the Western Mediterranean. A power that was older, wealthier, and commanded the seas, the city of Carthage. The conflict that followed, the 3 Punic Wars, was a crucible that would forge the Roman soul and nearly destroy it. The First Punic War forced Rome, a land power, to become a sea power. They captured a Carthaginian warship, reverse-engineered it, and built a fleet. They invented a device, the corvus, a great spiked boarding bridge that turned sea battles into land battles, allowing their superior infantry to dominate. They won Sicily. But it was the Second Punic War that descended into the stuff of epic nightmare. It was a war defined by one man, a figure of almost mythical terror in the Roman mind, Hannibal Barca. He did the impossible, marching an army, complete with war elephants from Spain, across the Pyrenees, and over the frozen Alps into the heart of Italy. He was a strategic genius without peer. At the river Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and then most catastrophically at Cannae, he inflicted defeats on Rome that would have shattered any other ancient state. At Cannae, perhaps 50,000 Roman soldiers were killed in a single day, encircled and annihilated in a tactical masterpiece that is still studied in military academies today. The city was in a state of shock. The gods seemed to have abandoned them. And here is one of the central mysteries of the Republic. Why didn't they surrender? Hannibal was on their doorstep. Their allies were defecting. Their armies were ghosts. Any other civilization would have sued for peace. But the Roman Senate refused. Led by men like Quintus Fabius Maximus, they adopted a chillingly patient strategy of harassment and delay, avoiding direct battle while Rome rebuilt its legions. bleeding Hannibal's forces dry over years of attrition. They drew on their vast Italian manpower reserves. They took the war to Spain, and then under the brilliant young General Scipio, they took the war to Africa, to the gates of Carthage itself. They defeated Hannibal not just with courage, but with a terrifying, cold-blooded resolve, a refusal to accept defeat, born from a system that distributed power so widely among the senatorial elite that no single faction could opt for the easy way out. They had too much to lose. They had built a system where victory was the only option, and when they finally won, their victory was absolute. Decades later, in the Third Punic War, driven by the paranoid mantra of the Senator Cato, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. They razed the city to the ground and sowed its fields with salt. It was an act of total annihilation, a chilling statement to the world. But victory was a poison. The Republic had conquered the world, and now that world came flooding back into Rome. Unimaginable wealth from tribute and plunder poured into the city. Hundreds of thousands of slaves from conquered lands were shipped to Italy, creating a new economic reality. The small family farms that were the backbone of the old republic could not compete with the vast, slave-run plantations, the latifundia, owned by the super-rich. Displaced farmers flooded into the city of Rome, a landless, jobless, angry urban mob. The traditional Roman values, the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, a reverence for duty, simplicity, and piety, seemed to dissolve in a new culture of Greek luxury, individualism, and conspicuous consumption. A deep philosophical and economic sickness had taken root in the heart of the Republic. The web of power was now strained to the breaking point. And into this volatile atmosphere stepped two brothers, two aristocrats who would try to fix the broken system, and in doing so would shatter it forever. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. They saw the crisis of the landless poor and proposed a radical solution: land reform. They wanted to enforce an old law limiting the amount of public land, the ager publicus, that one person could own, and redistribute the surplus to the poor. To the wealthy senators who controlled these vast estates, this was not reform. It was a declaration of war. Were the Gracchi noble populists, true champions of the people, or were they ambitious demagogues using the mob to build a personal power base in a way that threatened the collective rule of the Senate? The truth is likely a complex mix of both, but the Senate's response was unequivocal and brutal. They bypassed law and tradition. Tiberius Gracchus, a tribune of the plebs whose person was supposed to be sacrosanct, was clubbed to death in a riot instigated by senators. A decade later, his brother Gaius met a similar fate. These murders were a point of no return. A chilling precedent had been set. For centuries, political disputes in Rome had been settled through debate, law, and compromise. Now a new tool had been added to the political toolkit: violence. The unspoken rules that held the Republic together were broken. The door was now open for any man ruthless enough to walk through it. And the men who came next were warlords. The first was Gaius Marius, a new man, not from the old nobility. To fight off Germanic invasions, he made a fundamental change to the army. He abolished the property requirement for soldiers and recruited from the landless poor, promising them land and spoils upon retirement. In doing so, he created a professional army, but he also created a client army. These soldiers were loyal not to the abstract idea of SPQR, the Senate and people of Rome. They were loyal to their general, the man who fed them, paid them, and promised them a future. His rival was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, an aristocrat of the old school, a champion of the senatorial faction known as the Optimates. When their political rivalry escalated, Sulla did the unthinkable. He marched his army on the city of Rome itself. It was the ultimate transgression, a Roman general making war on his own country. He won, and he had himself declared dictator. Then he unleashed a terror unlike any Rome had ever seen, the proscriptions. He posted lists in the forum of his political enemies. Anyone on the list could be killed with impunity, and the person who killed them would receive a reward. Their property was confiscated by the state. It was a state-sanctioned murder spree, a bloody purge that allowed Sulla to eliminate his rivals and enrich his friends. Sulla eventually retired, but the damage was done. He had shown that the ultimate power in Rome no longer resided in the Senate or the voting assemblies. It resided in the man who controlled the most loyal legions. The final act of the Republic was a tragedy played out by giants. Three men, Pompey, the great general, Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and the ambitious, brilliant Julius Caesar formed a secret pact to control the state. The first triumvirate was not a legal office. It was a conspiracy, a gentleman's agreement to subvert the Republic for their own gain. Caesar took the governorship of Gaul, and for nearly a decade, he waged a brutal and brilliant campaign of conquest. He wasn't just winning territory for Rome. He was forging one of the finest armies the world had ever seen, an army fanatically loyal to him and him alone. And he amassed a personal fortune that made him immune to political pressure. He had become, in effect, an independent king operating on the frontiers. The Senate, championed by his former ally Pompey, grew terrified. They ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to stand trial. Caesar knew this was a death sentence. He brought his 13th legion to the banks of a small river in northern Italy, the Rubicon, the legal boundary of his province. To cross it with an army was an act of treason, an open declaration of war against the state. As he stood there on that fateful night in 49 B.C., he is said to have uttered the famous words, Alia iacta est, the die is cast. This wasn't a gamble. It was the inevitable, logical conclusion of a century of decay, the culmination of a process that began with the murder of the Gracchi that was institutionalized by Marius and Sulla. The Republic had been a hollow shell for decades. Caesar was simply the one who had the courage to kick it down. He swept through Italy, defeated Pompey, and became the master of Rome. He was declared dictator for life. He reformed the calendar, he settled his veterans, he planned grand building projects. But his power, his monarchical style, was an affront to the old families. And so, on the Ides of March 44 B.C., a group of senators calling themselves the Liberators, led by Brutus and Cassius, cornered him in the Senate House and stabbed him to death at the foot of a statue of his great rival Pompey. They claimed they had killed a tyrant and restored the Republic, but they had done no such thing. The Republic was a ghost, and they had only succeeded in creating a power vacuum. They had killed the man, but not the idea he represented. And in his will, that man had adopted a quiet, unassuming, and utterly ruthless great-nephew to be his heir. A teenager named Octavian, who would finish the work Caesar had started, and in the ashes of the Republic build an empire. The long, bloody, 500-year story of the Republic was over. It was a story of a small city that conquered the world, only to find that the spoils of that conquest had corroded its very soul. Its institutions, once its greatest strength, had become the battlefield for the ambitions of powerful men, and its end was a testament to a timeless, chilling truth. That liberty, once lost, is almost impossible to reclaim. The final, bloody act of the Republic closes. The daggers are cleaned, the stage is cleared, and a great, exhausted silence falls over the Mediterranean world. Decades of civil war, of prescriptions, of brothers fighting brothers, have bled the civilization dry. The people crave not glory, not liberty, but something far more fundamental, peace. And into this vacuum steps a young man, a teenager, really. Quiet, unassuming, chronically ill, but possessing a political genius that was cold, patient, and utterly absolute. He was Caesar's great-nephew, his adopted son. His name was Gaius Octavius, but the world would come to know him as Augustus. What he built was the great, magnificent lie at the heart of the Roman Empire. He never called himself a king or an emperor in the way we understand it. He was far too clever for that. In a masterful piece of political theater in 27 B.C., he went before the Senate and announced that he was relinquishing his extraordinary powers, that he was restoring the Republic. The senators, many of whom owed their lives and careers to him, gratefully hailed him as a savior. They showered him with honors and bestowed upon him the new name Augustus, the revered one, a title with a subtle, divine resonance, and they begged him to accept certain powers, to command the key legions on the frontiers, to safeguard the state. He accepted. Of course, he had orchestrated the entire performance. What emerged from this was the Augustan settlement, a system of breathtaking deception. He maintained the facade of the Republic. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected, but it was a hollow shell. Augustus held the real power. He controlled the army, the ultimate arbiter of Roman politics. He controlled the treasury thanks to his immense personal wealth, particularly the entire nation of Egypt, which he treated as his private estate. And he created a new elite military unit stationed in Rome itself, the Praetorian Guard, his personal bodyguards and the only army allowed near the capital. They were a permanent, chilling reminder of where true authority now resided. He called himself not Rex, king, or imperator, emperor, but princeps, first citizen. A humble, reassuring title, but it was a mask. Behind it was an autocrat of unparalleled skill. He was the architect of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of stability that would last for 2 centuries. He famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. And he did. He built temples, forums, aqueducts. He professionalized the civil service. He gave the world peace. But what was the cost of this peace? It was the final death of political freedom. It was a peace maintained by the threat of overwhelming military force. And it demanded a rigid, almost puritanical social order. Augustus passed strict moral legislation, punishing adultery and rewarding families for having more children. Yet his own family life was a quiet tragedy, a testament to the conflict between his public image and private reality. His only child, his daughter Julia, a vivacious and intelligent woman, chafed under his strict rules. He ultimately exiled her to a barren island for her alleged infidelities, a sacrifice to the very moral order he was trying to impose. The father of the nation could not save his own daughter. He had built a gilded cage, and his own family was trapped inside. When Augustus finally died after a long and masterful reign, the system he created faced its first great test. The brittle fiction of the restored republic was about to be exposed by the flawed, all-too-human men who followed him, the Julio-Claudian dynasty. His chosen successor was his stepson, Tiberius, a brilliant general but a gloomy, reluctant emperor who seemed to despise the very power he held. He was old, tired, and deeply suspicious of the senators who he felt had never respected him. His reign grew darker and darker, especially after he retreated from the daily business of Rome to the beautiful, isolated island of Capri off the Bay of Naples. And here the whispers begin. The historian Suetonius, writing decades later, paints a lurid picture of what happened on Capri. He speaks of depraved orgies, of cruelty and paranoia. But was this the truth? Or was it political slander, black propaganda spread by his enemies in the Senate to discredit a ruler they hated? Capri becomes a sort of black box, a mystery at the heart of his reign. What we know for certain is that in his absence, he left power in the hands of his ambitious praetorian prefect, Lucius Aelius Sejanus. Sejanus was, in effect, a shadow emperor. He controlled access to Tiberius, he ran the state, and he began quietly plotting to seize the throne for himself. When Tiberius finally uncovered the plot, his reaction was terrifying. A wave of treason trials, the Maestas trials, swept through the Roman aristocracy. Paranoia became institutionalized. A careless word, a poorly chosen dinner guest, could lead to accusation, confiscation of property, and execution. The air in Rome grew thick with fear. The peace of Augustus was revealing its hidden iron fist. When Tiberius died, he was succeeded by his grandnephew, a young man the soldiers had nicknamed Caligula, meaning little boots, from his time spent in the army camps as a boy. His early reign was full of promise. He was popular, generous, but within a few years something seemed to break. The stories of Caligula are the stuff of legend, that he engaged in incest with his sisters, that he declared himself a living god, that he waged a nonsensical war against the sea, ordering his soldiers to attack the waves and collect seashells as the spoils of victory. And most famously, that he planned to make his favorite horse, Incitatus, a consul. Was this genuine madness, a mind broken by absolute power, or was it something else, something more calculated and terrifying? Consider the act of making a horse a consul. It's not just a crazy act. It is the ultimate political statement. It is a gesture of supreme contempt for the institutions of the Republic. It is Caligula looking at the proud, ancient senators and saying, "Your most sacred office, the highest honor in Rome, is worth less to me than this animal. Your power is an illusion, and I can do anything I wish." It may not have been madness. It may have been a form of brutal, performance art terrorism designed to humiliate and terrify the elite into total submission. Whatever the motive, it failed. After just 4 years, the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, assassinated him. Their next choice of emperor was perhaps the most unlikely in Roman history. As the assassins rampaged through the palace, they found a man hiding behind a curtain, trembling with fear. It was Caligula's uncle, Claudius, a man who had been kept from public life his entire existence because he was considered an embarrassment. He had physical ailments, a limp, a stammer, a persistent drool. His own family thought him a fool. The Praetorian Guard, in a moment of chaotic inspiration, declared this trembling scholar the new master of the Roman world. And here is the mystery of Claudius. Was he the bumbling idiot everyone assumed him to be? Or was he a shrewd political survivor who had played the fool his entire life precisely to avoid the deadly intrigues of the imperial court? Once in power, he proved to be a surprisingly effective and diligent administrator. He oversaw the conquest of a new major province, Britain. He expanded citizenship. He reorganized the imperial bureaucracy. But his court remained a labyrinth of secrets and influence. He was dominated by his powerful, ambitious wives, first the notoriously promiscuous Messalina, and then his own niece, the cunning Agrippina the Younger. And he relied heavily on his Greek freedmen, former slaves, as his chief ministers. This was a scandal to the old Roman aristocracy, who was really running the empire. Was it the stammering scholar on the throne, or was it his wives and his freedmen pulling the strings from the shadows? Claudius's reign shows us a different kind of imperial weakness, not madness, but the diffusion of power into the hands of an unelected, unaccountable palace faction. Agrippina eventually convinced Claudius to adopt her own son from a previous marriage as his heir, sidelining Claudius's own son, Britannicus. Then, once her son was secure, Claudius died, allegedly poisoned by a mushroom arranged by Agrippina herself. The path was now clear for the final and most infamous of the Julio-Claudians, her son Nero. Nero began his reign well, under the guidance of the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. But as he grew older, his artistic ambitions and his paranoia overwhelmed his sense of duty. He fancied himself a great poet, a singer, a chariot racer. He had his own mother, Agrippina, murdered. He kicked his pregnant wife, Poppaea, to death in a fit of rage. And then in 64 A.D. came the Great Fire of Rome, a massive blaze that burned for over a week and destroyed much of the city. The historian Tacitus tells us the rumor spread that Nero had started the fire himself, so he could rebuild the city to his own glorious design, and that he had stood on his palace roof, playing his lyre and singing about the fall of Troy as the city burned. Did it really happen? Almost certainly not. It was likely a tragic accident, made worse by the narrow, winding streets of the ancient city. But Nero needed a scapegoat to deflect the public's fury, and he found one in a small, secretive, and widely misunderstood religious sect, the Christians. He accused them of starting the fire and unleashed a horrific persecution. They were crucified, burned alive as human torches to illuminate his gardens, and torn apart by dogs in the arena. It was a brutal act of political deflection. The fire and Nero's self-indulgent project to build a massive golden palace on the cleared land destroyed his popularity. Revolts broke out across the empire, and the Senate declared him a public enemy. Abandoned by all, he committed suicide, reportedly lamenting, "What an artist dies in me." The chaos that followed the year of the 4 emperors was a bloody reminder that the stability of the Pax Romana rested entirely on the character of one man. But order was restored by Vespasian, a pragmatic, no-nonsense general who founded the short-lived Flavian dynasty. His greatest gift to the city was a masterpiece of political populism. On the very land where Nero had built his indulgent private palace, Vespasian began construction of a massive public amphitheater, a place for the people. We know it today as the Colosseum. Think of the symbolism. It is a magnificent architectural and engineering marvel, but it is a shadow in the sunlight. It was a place built for mass spectacle and mass slaughter, a place where thousands of gladiators and condemned criminals would die for the entertainment of the Roman crowds. It was the ultimate expression of bread and circuses, the state's method for keeping a restless urban population docile and distracted by feeding their stomachs and sating their lust for blood. It was order maintained through the brutal, mesmerizing theater of death. After the Flavians, Rome entered what is often considered its true zenith, the era of the five good emperors, a century of stability governed by a succession of capable and dedicated rulers. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. This was the system working at its absolute best, and its secret was the abandonment of hereditary succession. Each emperor chose his successor not by blood but by merit, adopting the most capable man he could find as his son and heir. But even here in this golden age, the shadows lengthen. The system of adoption, while effective, was an admission of the fundamental flaw in monarchy. It was an artificial fix, a delicate chain that could be broken at any time by a single bad decision. Under Trajan, the empire reached its absolute greatest territorial extent, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. But it was a high-water mark, a moment of unsustainable overreach. His successor, Hadrian, a complex and brilliant man, recognized this. He spent most of his reign traveling, consolidating the frontiers, not expanding them. He built his famous wall across the north of Britain. A wall is a symbol of security, but it is also a symbol of limitation. It was the first time the Roman Empire, in a monumental public work, admitted that its growth was finite. The psychological shift from boundless offense to a permanent defensive posture had begun. The long, peaceful reign of Antoninus Pius was the calm before the storm, and the storm broke over the head of the last of the good emperors, the philosopher king Marcus Aurelius. He was a man who prized Stoic philosophy, who wrote in his private meditations about tranquility, reason, and accepting one's duty without complaint. And yet his reign was anything but tranquil. He spent almost all of it on the cold, grim Danube frontier, fighting brutal attritional wars against Germanic tribes who were now pressing against the empire's borders with a new intensity. His troops brought back not just victory, but a devastating plague, the Antonine Plague, that may have killed millions, weakening the empire's economy and military at a critical moment. His reign was a paradox, a man of peace forced to be a man of war. And in the end, he was broken not by the barbarians or the plague, but by his own heart. He had a biological son, Commodus, and unlike his four predecessors, Marcus Aurelius did not choose the best man for the job. He chose his own blood. It was a deeply human, understandable decision, and it was the single most disastrous decision of the 2nd century. He knew his son's character, vain, unstable, obsessed with gladiatorial combat. Yet he broke the fragile chain of adoption that had given Rome a century of stability. This single act of fatherly love over Stoic duty would bring the golden age to a screeching, violent halt. The shadows that had been gathering at the edges of the Pax Romana were about to flood the entire empire, plunging it into an age of chaos, assassination, and terror. The gilded cage, so carefully constructed by Augustus and maintained for 2 centuries, was about to be torn apart. The golden age, the long summer of the Antonines, ends not with a gentle autumn, but with a sudden, violent frost. The philosopher king Marcus Aurelius dies on the frozen Danube frontier, and the mantle of power, the sacred purple, passes to his son Commodus. And with him, the carefully maintained facade of the Augustan Principate begins to crack, crumble, and then utterly disintegrate. Commodus was not a tyrant in the mold of a Tiberius or a Nero, driven by complex paranoia or artistic delusion. His was a simpler, cruder pathology. He was a man consumed by ego who found the tedious duties of governance to be an insufferable bore. He craved not the respect of the Senate, but the roar of the crowd. His obsession was the gladiatorial arena. He would enter the Colosseum not as a spectator, but as a combatant, styling himself as the reincarnation of Hercules. Of course, these were not true contests. His opponents were terrified professionals paid to lose, or maimed soldiers and amputees who could offer no real resistance. He would charge the imperial treasury exorbitant sums for each of his victories. This wasn't just corruption, it was a profound ideological break. The emperor was meant to be the pater patriae, the father of the country, a figure of stoic dignity. Commodus transformed himself into a performer, a celebrity athlete, debasing the office to the level of public spectacle. He was a symptom of a deep sickness, a sign that the traditions that had held the empire together were losing their power. His predictable end came not on the sands of the arena, but in his bath, strangled by his wrestling partner in a palace coup. His death did not restore order. It opened the floodgates. What followed was a fever dream, beginning with the year of the 5 emperors, and culminating in one of the most shameful episodes in Roman history. After the Praetorian Guard murdered Commodus's successor, the virtuous but strict Pertinax, they did something that revealed the true rotten core of the system. They put the Roman Empire up for sale. They held an auction at the gates of their camp. The winner was a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus, who literally purchased the throne with the promise of a massive bonus to the guards. It was a moment of shocking clarity. The imperial purple was no longer a sacred trust. It was a commodity. The real power brokers were no longer the Senate or the people, but the soldiers with the sharpest swords and the shallowest loyalties. Julianus's reign, bought with cash, lasted only 66 days before a far more serious power, the frontier legions, intervened. From the brutal civil war that followed, a new kind of emperor emerged, a man who would codify the new reality. His name was Septimius Severus. He was not a Roman from an old Italian family. He was a provincial, born in Leptis Magna in modern-day Libya, a tough, ruthless, and brilliant soldier who spoke Latin with a Punic accent. He disbanded the disgraced Praetorians and established a new dynasty based on one simple principle: the absolute primacy of the military. His famous deathbed advice to his 2 sons was the new gospel of the Roman state. Enrich the soldiers, he told them, and scorn all other men. The unspoken partnership between emperor, senate, and people was officially dead. There was only the army. His son, Caracalla, a cruel and brutish man who murdered his own brother in their mother's arms, made one of the most consequential decisions of the era. In 212 A.D., he issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, an edict that granted Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. For centuries, historians have debated this act. Was it a moment of enlightened universalism, the culmination of Rome's long journey from city-state to world-state? Or was it, as the historian Cassius Dio claimed, a cynical tax grab? New citizens meant new taxpayers, and Caracalla's soldiers were expensive. The truth is likely both, but it was another tectonic shift. The special status of Italy was gone. The empire was now a vast, uniform territory, governed by a military autocracy, its people united not by culture or origin, but by a shared legal status and a shared burden of taxation to fund the legions. The Severan dynasty ended as it began, in violence. The bizarre reign of the sun priest emperor Elagabalus and the eventual murder of the final Severan, Alexander, by his own troops who considered him weak, kicked the door wide open. The empire now plunged headlong into the maelstrom. We call it the crisis of the 3rd century. But that clinical phrase fails to capture the sheer, terrifying chaos of those 50 years. It was less a crisis and more a complete, systemic unraveling. Imagine a perfect storm where every possible catastrophe happens at once. First, there was the political anarchy. The throne became a death sentence. At least 26 barracks emperors were proclaimed by their legions, most reigning for only a year or two before being assassinated by a rival or their own disgruntled troops. The empire became a meat grinder for its own leaders. The average lifespan of an emperor was shorter than that of a common gladiator. Second, the frontiers exploded. The old enemies were gone, replaced by new, larger, and more aggressive confederations. The Goths and other tribes poured across the Danube frontier in the Balkans. In the east, the old Parthian Empire had been overthrown and replaced by the far more centralized and aggressive Sassanid Persian Empire. The Sassanids saw themselves as the heirs to the ancient Persian glory of Cyrus and Darius, and they were determined to reclaim the lands of the Middle East from Rome. In a moment of ultimate humiliation, the Persian king Shapur captured the Roman Emperor Valerian alive in battle. The Emperor of Rome, the master of the world, was said to have been used as a human footstool by the Persian king before being executed, skinned, and his hide stuffed and put on display. The psychological shock to the Roman world is impossible to overstate. The empire's aura of invincibility was shattered. Third, the economy simply ceased to function. To pay the armies that were constantly proclaiming them, emperors debased the currency, minting coins with less and less silver, until they were little more than bronze tokens with a silver wash. The result was hyperinflation on a scale the world had never seen. Savings were wiped out. A soldier's salary could barely buy him food. The complex, monetized trade network that had been the lifeblood of the Pax Romana broke down. The economy reverted to a primitive system of barter and requisition. And finally, the empire itself began to fracture. With the central government in chaos, local leaders took matters into their own hands. In the West, a general named Postumus established a breakaway Gallic empire, encompassing Gaul, Britain, and Spain. In the East, the brilliant and charismatic Queen Zenobia of Palmyra carved out her own empire from the Roman provinces of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. For a time, the Roman Empire was divided into 3 warring pieces. It seemed, by any rational measure, to be over. And this is the central question of the darkness. How did it survive? Why did Rome not simply collapse into a collection of successor states, like the empire of Alexander the Great? The answer is as complex as the crisis itself. Part of it was the deep, institutional resilience of Roman administration, which continued to function at a local level even when the center was in chaos. Part of it was the emergence of a series of tough, no-nonsense soldier emperors from the province of Illyricum, modern-day Balkans, men like Claudius Gothicus and the brilliant Aurelian. Aurelian, in a whirlwind 5-year reign, defeated the secessionist empires, reunified the Roman world, and earned the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. He built a massive new defensive wall around the city of Rome, a stark admission that the security of the Pax Romana was gone forever. But his assassination continued the cycle of violence. The empire was stitched back together, but the patient was still bleeding. It needed more than a brilliant general. It needed a new system, a radical cure for a terminal disease. The man who provided it was Diocletian. Like the other soldier emperors, he was a man of humble birth from the Balkans who rose through the military ranks. But he was different. He was not just a soldier. He was a radical visionary, an organizer of genius. He looked at the wreckage of the 3rd century and understood that the old empire, the principate founded by Augustus, was gone. It could not be repaired. It had to be replaced. And so he created a new system so strange and revolutionary it almost feels alien. It was called the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. Having fought his way to supreme power, Diocletian did the most unexpected thing imaginable. He voluntarily shared it. He appointed a co-emperor, an Augustus, to rule the West while he ruled the East. Then he appointed 2 junior emperors, called Caesars, one for each Augustus. The empire was divided into 4 administrative quadrants, each with its own emperor and its own capital, closer to the volatile frontiers. This was not a division of the empire, it was a division of labor. It was a stunningly pragmatic admission that the job of ruling Rome had become too big for one man. But the Tetrarchy was more than just an administrative reshuffle. It was a new ideology of power. The emperor was no longer the princeps, the first citizen. That gentle fiction was discarded. He was now Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. This was the dominate. Emperors were now remote, sacred figures, surrounded by elaborate court ceremonial drawn from the Persian monarchy. One no longer stood before the emperor, one prostrated oneself. To support this new, larger government and an even larger army, Diocletian implemented a new, brutal, and ruthlessly efficient tax system, the capitatio iugatio, based on counts of heads, capita, and units of land, iuga. To stop people from abandoning their jobs, he made many professions hereditary by law. A baker's son must become a baker. A soldier's son must become a soldier. The fluid society of the early empire was hardening into a rigid, caste-like system. Did Diocletian save the empire? Yes, arguably he did. But the empire he saved was a different place. It was a more centralized, more bureaucratic, more autocratic, and far more oppressive state. He had stopped the bleeding by putting the patient in a full-body cast. And in his drive for absolute unity and control, he identified one institution that he could not dominate: the Christian Church. He saw its hierarchy, its deep community bonds, its allegiance to a higher power as a state within his state, a threat that had to be eliminated. The result was the Great Persecution, the most systematic and brutal attempt to eradicate Christianity in the empire's history. Diocletian's logical, machine-like system had only one weakness: human ambition. In 305 AD, he did the truly unprecedented. He voluntarily abdicated his throne and forced his co-emperor to do the same, retiring to his massive, fortified palace in Split to grow cabbages. But his elegant plan for a smooth succession of the Caesars collapsed almost immediately into a new round of civil wars, as the sons of the former emperors clamored for the power they saw as their birthright. From this new vortex of violence, one man would emerge victorious. A man who would complete the transformation of the Roman world in a way even Diocletian could never have imagined. His name was Constantine. He was the son of one of Diocletian's Caesars, and his army proclaimed him emperor in York, Britain. And as he marched into Italy to face his rival Maxentius, something happened that remains one of the great turning points and one of the deepest mysteries of Western history. Before the decisive battle of the Milvian Bridge just outside Rome, Constantine is said to have looked to the sky and seen a vision, a cross of light emblazoned with the words in hoc signo vinces, "In this sign you will conquer." This is the ultimate question that hangs in the darkness of the 4th century. Was this a moment of genuine, profound, divine revelation? A true conversion experience that transformed the man and through him the world? Or was Constantine, the son of a father who had been tolerant of Christians, a political calculator of supreme genius? Did he look at the state of the empire and see in the growing, resilient, highly organized Christian faith a new, more powerful ideological glue than the old, tired pagan gods? Did he see a path to victory and to a new kind of unified state built not on the old traditions of Rome, but on the foundation of this vibrant, future-facing religion? We can never know for certain what was in his heart, but we know what he did. He ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol on their shields. He won the battle. He became the sole master of the Roman world. He issued the Edict of Milan, granting tolerance to Christianity. He presided over church councils. He founded a new Christian capital, a new Rome, on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium, Constantinople. And he began the long, complex process of fusing the power of the Roman state with the authority of the Christian church. And the transformation was now complete. The world of Augustus, the world of the Senate, of Cicero, of Virgil, of the Olympian gods was gone forever. A new world had been born from the crucible of the crisis. A world whose center of gravity was shifting to the east. A world that would be defined by a new faith. A world ruled by a remote, god-like emperor governing a rigid, bureaucratic state. The crisis was over, but the Roman Empire that emerged from the darkness was a profoundly different civilization, standing on the threshold of a new and uncertain age. The Roman world, transformed by the crisis and Constantine's revolution, now stood on the precipice of its final great divergence. The empire was still, in theory, a single, unified entity. But in practice, it was becoming two distinct worlds, breathing with two different sets of lungs, their fates drifting apart on the currents of history. The formal division came in the year 395 A.D., upon the death of the last emperor to rule the entire Roman world, Theodosius the Great. He bequeathed the empire not to a single heir, but to his two sons. The east went to his elder son, Arcadius, who would rule from the magnificent city of Constantinople. The west went to his younger son, Honorius, who would preside over a court that soon retreated from the vulnerable city of Rome to the swamp-protected fortress of Ravenna. This was not the cause of the fracture. It was the formal recognition of it, the final acknowledgement of a schism that had been growing for a century. To understand what happens next, we have to understand the profound, fundamental differences between these two halves of the same imperial body. Imagine the Eastern Empire, what we will later call Byzantium. Its heart was Constantinople, a city strategically positioned on the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the vital trade routes of the Black Sea and the Aegean. It was a fortress city, protected by the sea on three sides and by the most formidable defensive fortifications ever built, the massive Theodosian walls on the fourth. The East was the older, wealthier, more urbanized part of the Roman world. It contained the ancient, populous cities of Antioch, Alexandria, and Ephesus. It held the empire's economic engine, the vast grain fields of Egypt, the breadbasket of the ancient world, and the rich, resilient heartland of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, a deep reservoir of soldiers and taxpayers. The East could lose a battle, even an entire army, and still have the economic and demographic depth to recover. Now imagine the West. It was vast, but it was also hollowed out. Its economy was more agrarian, its cities smaller and less dynamic. Its center of gravity had shifted north to Gaul and the Rhine frontier, but its heart was still meant to be Italy, an Italy that was now more of a consumer of taxes than a producer of wealth. The Western government was poorer, its tax base more fragile, and most critically, its frontiers were long, porous, and increasingly difficult to defend. The Rhine and Danube rivers were not impassable barriers. They were highways for migrating peoples, peoples who were being pushed with a new and terrifying urgency. Because a new force had appeared out of the vast, mysterious steppes of Central Asia, a nomadic people of legendary ferocity. The Huns. They were the great catalyst, the geopolitical billiard ball that would strike the Germanic peoples living along Rome's frontiers, sending them scattering in a desperate search for safety and new lands inside the empire. The Huns didn't conquer Rome, not directly. They simply created an unstoppable wave of human migration that the brittle structure of the Western Empire could no longer withstand. In the year 406, on a bitterly cold winter's night, the Rhine River froze solid, and across that frozen bridge walked a vast multitude of peoples, Vandals, Suebi, Alans pouring into the Roman province of Gaul. The Western Roman army, stretched thin and preoccupied with a Gothic threat in Italy, could do nothing. This wasn't a raid. It was a permanent migration. A vast portion of Gaul was lost forever. The empire was hemorrhaging territory, and with that territory went its tax base and its source of new recruits. It was the beginning of a death spiral. The Gothic threat in Italy was led by a chieftain named Alaric. Alaric did not want to destroy Rome. He was a Christian, and he had served in the Roman army. What he wanted was a place for his people, a secure homeland within the empire, and a title for himself within the Roman command structure. He was negotiating. But the Western court in Ravenna, paralyzed by indecision and anti-Germanic sentiment, repeatedly rebuffed him. The court's most capable defender was a man named Stilicho, the Magister Militum, or Master of Soldiers. He was a Vandal by birth, but utterly loyal to Rome, and he had defeated Alaric in battle before. But here is one of the great, tragic mysteries of the fall. The Roman court, consumed by paranoia, began to whisper that Stilicho was a traitor, that his Vandal heritage meant he was secretly plotting with Alaric. In 408, the Emperor Honorius was persuaded to have his most effective general arrested and executed. It was a catastrophic, self-inflicted wound. With Stilicho gone, the path to Rome was open. In 410, Alaric and his Goths marched down the Italian peninsula and did what had not been done in 800 years. They sacked the city of Rome. Militarily, the sack was not devastating. The Goths stayed only 3 days and were more interested in plunder than destruction. But the psychological impact on the Roman world was an earthquake. The news spread to every corner of the Mediterranean. Rome, the eternal city, the sacred, inviolable heart of the world, had been defiled. St. Jerome, writing in Bethlehem, lamented, "The lamp of the world has been extinguished." The great theologian, St. Augustine, was compelled to write his masterpiece, The City of God, to explain to Christians how this could have happened, arguing that the true city of God was in heaven, and that all earthly cities, even Rome, were destined to fall. The idea of Rome's permanence, its divine destiny, was broken. The unraveling now accelerated. The Goths eventually moved on, settling in southwestern Gaul as nominal Roman allies or foederati. But another group, the Vandals, would deliver the economic death blow. Led by their cunning and brilliant king, Gaiseric, the Vandals crossed the Straits of Gibraltar from Spain into North Africa in 429. Over the next decade, they conquered the province, culminating in the capture of the great city of Carthage in 439. This was arguably a more devastating blow than the sack of Rome itself. North Africa was the agricultural heart of the Western Empire. It was the source of the grain dole that fed the massive, restless population of Rome, and it was the source of a huge portion of the Western government's tax revenue. Without the grain, the emperor could not keep the people of Rome fed and pacified. Without the taxes, he could not pay his army. The loss of Africa was the point of no return. The Western Roman state was now functionally bankrupt, and still it staggered on, a ghost of its former self. A new terror had emerged from the east, Attila the Hun, the scourge of God. He ravaged the Balkans, defeated Eastern Roman armies, and then turned his attention west toward Gaul. In this moment of supreme crisis, the West produced its last great Roman commander, a man of immense skill and diplomatic cunning named Flavius Aetius. Aetius cobbled together a coalition army, a patchwork of his remaining Roman troops and Germanic allies, including the very Visigoths who had sacked Rome decades earlier. On the Catalonian plains in 451, this alliance fought Attila's Huns to a bloody standstill, saving Gaul from conquest. It was a stunning victory, a sign that the Roman military ideal, even in its twilight, could still work miracles. But the political system was too sick to be saved. The Emperor Valentinian Roman III, a weak and insecure man, grew jealous of his great general's success. Just 2 years after Aetius saved the empire, the emperor summoned him to the palace and murdered him with his own hands. It was an act of incredible folly and ingratitude. A few months later, Valentinian himself was assassinated by 2 of Aetius's loyal soldiers. The political leadership of the West was now in a state of terminal, self-devouring chaos. The last 20 years of the Western Roman Empire are a sad and confusing epilogue. Real power no longer resided with the emperors in Ravenna. They were little more than puppets, shadow emperors, installed and deposed by a series of powerful Germanic military commanders who held the real title of authority. Magister Militum. The most powerful of these was Ricimer, who for nearly 2 decades was the true master of Italy, making and unmaking emperors at will. The empire was an empire in name only. Its authority barely extended beyond the borders of Italy. Gaul was divided between Visigoths, Burgundians, and the emerging Franks. Spain was controlled by the Suebi and Visigoths. Britain, abandoned by the legions decades earlier, was slowly being taken over by Anglo-Saxons. North Africa was the independent Vandal kingdom. There was almost nothing left to rule. The final act came in 476. The commander of the Germanic troops in Italy, a man named Orsts, had deposed the emperor and placed his own young son on the throne. In a moment of supreme historical irony, the boy's name was Romulus Augustus. Though he was so young and insignificant, they called him Augustulus, the little Augustus. The first founder and the first emperor rolled into one pathetic final figure. His Germanic troops in the Roman army, by now the army was almost entirely composed of men of Germanic heritage, demanded what their brethren in Gaul and Spain had received, permanent land grants in Italy. When Orsts refused, the troops mutinied. They raised up one of their own officers, a German named Odoacer, as their leader. Odoacer captured and executed Orsts and marched on Ravenna. But what happened next was not a great, bloody conquest. It was a simple administrative procedure. Odoacer deposed the boy emperor, Romulus Augustulus, but he didn't kill him. He simply gave him a generous pension and sent him off to retire in a countryside villa near Naples. Then Odoacer did something very telling. He gathered up the imperial insignia, the purple robes, the diadem, the scepter, and he sent them to the Eastern Roman Emperor, Zeno, in Constantinople. The accompanying letter carried a simple message. The West no longer required an emperor of its own. One emperor in Constantinople was sufficient for the whole empire. This is the moment we traditionally mark as the fall of the Roman Empire. But there was no dramatic collapse, no final battle for Rome. It was just a quiet recognition of a reality that had existed for decades. It was the administration of last rites for a body that had long been dead. Odoacer became the first king of Italy, ruling nominally as the viceroy of the emperor in Constantinople, but in reality as an independent Germanic king. And why did the East survive this storm? They faced the same external pressures, the same migrating peoples, but they had deeper roots. They had the strategic geography, the impregnable walls of their capital. They had the more vibrant economy and the deeper pool of manpower. And they had a more sophisticated and cynical diplomatic machine. They became masters of paying off one barbarian group to attack another. They frequently used their vast gold reserves to persuade would-be invaders, including Attila, to turn their attention away from the rich provinces of the East and toward the softer targets of the West. It's a dark thought, but it's possible the Eastern court saw the collapse of the West not as a tragedy, but as a necessary sacrifice for their own survival. The Roman Empire, then, did not truly fall in 476. It simply lost its western half. The great river of Roman civilization had hit a massive obstacle and had split into 2 streams. One stream in the west would fragment and water the soil from which the new Germanic kingdoms of medieval Europe would grow. But the other stream in the east would continue to flow, strong and deep, for another 1,000 years. It would continue to call itself the Roman Empire. and it would carry the legacy of Roman law, administration, and culture through a new millennium, a shining, a defiant ghost of the glory that had once been Rome. The political entity of Rome is gone. Its legions have turned to dust, but its ghost is all around us, in the languages we speak, in the laws that govern us, in the very foundations of the buildings we inhabit. But what of the other legacies, the hidden ones, the questions we started with? The secrets of Roman concrete, a material that grows stronger with time, a formula we are only now beginning to fully understand. The sophisticated hydraulics and urban planning that suggest a level of knowledge that seems anachronistic. The story of Rome is a story of power, of civilization, but it is also a tapestry of unsolved mysteries. A reminder that history is not a settled thing. It is a living echo. As you drift deeper now into the quiet of the night, let your mind wander through those echoes. The empire may have fallen, but its secrets, its questions, and its profound influence remain. They are waiting in the shadows of the past, challenging us to listen, to learn, and to wonder.